Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk with you about something that has been near and dear to my heart since my doctoral program, and that was in 1999. And I have to also say that Freddie Hebert was a great inspiration during that time. I read a piece that she wrote in 1998 in the Reading Teacher about beginning reading text, and I was so struck with both the intelligence and the bravery with which she said many important things that needed to be said at the height of a time when really only one kind of text was predominating. So I am completely honored to be a part of anything that she has to do with, because I know she is really a pioneer, and that as a country we're very lucky to have her. So I'm going to talk about this notion of stretching students in text and what we know so far about that. The presentation will have 5 parts. The first part will be addressing what exactly is meant by complex text. The second part will address what is meant by stretch text. The term stretch is not one that we typically see or hear in elementary schools, but it is used in the Common Core, and we're going to see a lot more of it. Then I'm going to give some basic rationales or reasons why we've seen people forwarding this notion of stretching students. The bulk of the presentation will focus on how and when to stretch students, what evidence we currently have, and then I'll briefly recap with some basic take-home messages for the classroom. It is true that a lot of the research is currently being developed in this area, and so there's a lot of empirical work that's left to be done, but still there's information that can be taken back. So, by now you've probably heard of complex text, and you probably know that the Common Core standards are very focused on that. In fact, the addressing of text in a standards document like the Common Core is really novel, and it's very important that it's addressed. And so people like Freddie and myself are really excited to see that happening. So according to the Common Core state standards, the English language arts section, complex text is about the ability of a reader to connect, read, and comprehend a text with consideration to both reader and task variables. And you'll know the 3-part model for assessing text complexity, the triangular diagram that you've seen. It essentially suggests that there are 3 different pieces to assessing text complexity. Qualitative pieces referring to those things that would be best addressed by humans, so anything that has to do with maybe theme or topic. A lot of the qualitative leveling systems fall into this category. The quantitative systems are typically the readability systems, the new 2nd generation ones that have been harnessing the power of the computer, as well as the older ones upon which many of those are based. Cohesion would also be included in the quantitative factors, and some other interesting new developments as well. And then the 3rd factor is reader and task elements. In other words, in assessing text complexity, we have to attend to what readers bring and the kinds of things that we're asking students to do with text, as in the task, because that will impact how easy or hard the text is for them. So most people are very aware of that model. I want to just give you 2 brief ideas to suggest that text complexity and text difficulty might not be synonymous. Within the Common Core state standards, those 2 terms are used interchangeably. So text difficulty and text complexity from the Common Core perspective are really almost the same. From our perspective, in a piece that we put together about a year ago, we took the view that text complexity was in fact the features of text. So, for example, that might mean any of those things within a text that can be thought of, such as length of sentences, the difficulty of words, the frequency of words, number of complex sentences, and on and on and on. There are literally tens of variables that can be accounted for when we think about text features. I use this little graphic here of an interwoven basket because that's exactly what text is like. In fact, the word complex comes from the Latin complectere, which means with braiding. So complex means to be intricate and interwoven, and that is exactly what text is. And that's one of the reasons that it's very difficult to do text complexity research, because all of the elements of text are very connected and interwoven, and when you change one thing, you tend to change the other. From our view, text complexity is different from text difficulty. Difficulty is connecting the features of text to readers' performance. And forgive me for omitting an apostrophe there, but it's essentially using those features to then relate to a measure of a reader's ability to comprehend a text with said features. So we kind of take those two things apart because we think that they're different things. From the perspective of the Common Core, there has been focus on both the qualitative and the reader task variables, but there's been very specific focus on the quantitative staircase or measures. And if you haven't seen this before, it's in Appendix A. I believe it's in the supplement that came out. On the left-hand side are the grade levels, ranging from the second, third. They're organized into bands, and at the end, that CCR is career and college ready. Up top, marking the columns are the various readability formulas that are out there, the quantitative measures. ATOS is the Renaissance Learning measure, degrees of reading powers, Questar, Flesch-Kincaid, we all know. Lexile framework, we pretty much all know it's a recalibrated readability formula. Reading maturity is a newer form, and so is SourceRater. What you will notice is that these new parameters are in fact very much challenging students. And so if we look at, for example, the second and third grade band, and we look at the ATOS readability level, you can see that the expectation is that students at the end of third grade would be reading at a fifth grade reading level. Now, ordinarily you would expect kids at the end of third grade to be reading at a fourth grade reading level, and you can see that this has stepped up a grade level, as it is in fifth grade, 8th grade, and 10th grade. If you think that, for example, those are just ranges and that students really don't have to meet those, you need only look at the actual standards to learn that that's not the case. So here is the wording for the informational text standard for the second and third grade, and what you can see is in second grade, the ending part of this standard says with scaffolding is needed at the higher levels, meaning that the expectation might not be that second graders are reading at a fifth grade reading level. But in third grade, it very clearly says that students should be reading independently and proficiently at that fifth grade reading level. So, you know, those readability levels are actually referred to in Standard 10, and it seems that from the standards, these are going to be the levels that kids are expected to read. And of course, these will guide assessments and the development of educational publishing houses. So what is stretch text? That's a very much a unique term in elementary school, and I don't know what that picture, you know, what that word conjures up for many of you. For me, it conjures really athletic stretching, which sometimes can be difficult, but the idea is it's really about challenging kids, and most people agree that we all want to challenge kids. Here's the wording in the Common Core, and again, it's not in the standards themselves, but if you read a lot of the ancillary literature and a lot of the people who've been writing about the Common Core, you will see these notions of rigorous text and stretch text coming up in pieces. So the idea is that students need opportunity to stretch their reading abilities, and then that there are particular tasks that may require students to read harder text than they would normally be required to. So if we look at this language and then we look at the quantitative guidelines and the readability formulas, you can see there is a clear expectation of stepping things up for kids really across K-12. The question is how to do that. I just want to briefly kind of contrast what we've typically been using as parameters in elementary grades. Typically what we've referred to have been the word accuracy levels and the comprehension levels that Betts fleshed out in 1946, and so most people are really familiar with these. That red box represents frustrational text, and those are texts that go beyond word accuracy, and you know the other parameters. I think what's really important about the traditional parameter is that that line between instructional text and frustrational text was not to be crossed. That was really a hard and fast line, kind of a brick wall, and kids under no circumstances were to be using frustrational text, despite the fact that the empirical basis for Betts' parameters was not real firm. Now what we're starting to see, he had to come back just to reiterate that point, we are starting to see those parameters questioned, especially with respect to what's frustrational. And we're starting to see that hard line between instructional text and frustrational text to soften up depending on the circumstances. And so we're seeing a blurred line between those two areas. So depending on a student's a reader's developmental stage, their interest, and the text length, and of course many other factors, a text may or may not be frustrational, and that line may move back and forth. So essentially we're seeing with the Common Core a shift in reader text paradigms. The traditional paradigm really emphasized the avoidance of frustration. The current paradigm really focuses on the avoidance of stagnation. I think the trick is to avoid the inevitable swing. So what we want to do in this kind of coming up era is to avoid frustration and avoid stagnation and strike a balance of optimal challenge. Of course, we really need an empirically based paradigm of challenge, and we need to really address questions in the literature. For example, how much can kids be stretched before they break? What is the threshold? Where is the point that they just are not reaping any benefits from stretch or challenge text? What text and task features influence stretch? And when developmentally are kids stretched and within which context? And development really changes so much during the elementary years that that is very important for the dialogue about elementary text. There are 4 rationales that are suggested for reasons that we might stretch students. Some of them not so focused on elementary learners, some of them really strong. The one thing that's important for people to know, especially if you go back and you read that Appendix A, is that one of the primary reasons that have been given for adjusting the text parameters up is because there was a very influential study done by ACT that found that there was what I call a text complexity chasm. There was a significant difference between what kids were being exposed to in high school and what they were being required to read for college and career. And the research basically found that a student's ability to earn a B or better in a social science course in college was heavily related to the complexity of the text to which they were exposed in high school. And that has kind of resulted in a distribution of harder text across the K-12 curriculum. The second rationale supporting the text complexity increases was a study conducted in 2006, and Essentially, the solid line represents the performance of North Carolina students, and the dotted lines represent the complexity of text to which the students were exposed. And from this, what you can see is that there seems to be kind of a ceiling effect going on, with kids not going significantly above what they were exposed to. During this period, North Carolina was actually doing incredibly well. But this partly is the rationale for increasing text complexity. The third rationale, and this one I completely agree with, is that there really isn't a whole lot of research to support the traditional reader text boundaries that many of us use in the elementary schools. So, you know, we're treating those as really holy grails, and they're really not. The fourth rationale is a reason to kind of focus on text that is stretch text, is because challenge actually is good. I think the introduction of focusing on stretch rather than frustration as much as we have in the past is a good thing. So I welcome that shift in paradigm, because I think a paradigm of challenge is exactly what we need. We just have to be cautious, because overwhelming frustration is not a good thing, and we've all witnessed that quite powerfully. So I want to talk much more about how and when to stretch readers. And there are many different things to think about with respect to challenging students in elementary grades. Some of them have been introduced, and some of them have not. And the first is length. And length is something that we haven't given a great deal of attention to in the elementary grades, but I can tell you that it changes a great deal. I mean, think about what a first grader reads in terms of the length of a text, and think about what a fifth grader might read, and that will impact students' abilities to stretch. Word accuracy levels, as I mentioned, the BETS parameters are not necessarily research-based, and many people have questioned how accurate do kids really need to be to comprehend, and maybe it's not at the levels we used to think. If we're going to stretch kids, we kind of have to have a toolkit of strategies, and we have to have some basic information that frankly is often missing in classrooms. And so we don't necessarily need to reinvent a whole lot of new stuff in some situations. We know how to match kids to books. We just have to use it. Stamina is the ability to persevere through a task with success. If we're going to stretch kids, especially if we think about length and increasing difficulty, we're going to have to teach them how to persevere through something that's very challenging. And we can't just expect them to do it. We have to show them how. We have to teach for stamina, and more research can be done in that area. We can alter the text levels relative to the student's reading level, and so we can think about, could we read as much as a grade level ahead or above a kid's reading level, and would that be appropriate stretch level? What do they do? We have to give some attention to genre, because, as you know, informational text and narrative fiction have very different demands, and they're going to impact students' abilities to stretch. And then finally, we need to give some consideration to the background or the history that the reader has had. If you have persevered through a task and been successful, you're going to have a much different orientation towards being stretched than if you've persevered through tasks and been unsuccessful time after time. So I'm going to begin by talking about genre and just illustrating a simple issue that can take place when you use readability formulas to assess text of different genre. This is a narrative fiction text. It's Boy by Roald Dahl, and it's an autobiography. It's a wonderful autobiography. And if we looked at this and we analyzed it using the Dale Chall, which is a really nice formula, we find that it's on about a 7th or 8th grade reading level. So that would be, you know, a 7th grade reading level, or 6.86 would be something we would be expecting an end of the year 5th grader to read. The highlighted words are the new or unknown words. They would be the rare words in the formula. What you can get from this is that formulas work as formulas are going to work. They are computer-based, they are not thinking. And most formulas are based on the sentence length in words and the frequency of individual words. And so individual words are compared to a word list, in this case the Dale-Chall word list, and then words that are not found on that list are identified as rare or sophisticated or infrequent, whatever terminology you want to use. So in this narrative piece, what you can see is that there's very little repetition of those rare words. Now you do see the word floorboard repeated, but other than that, you see many words that are new. However, if you look at the difficulty of these words, they might be rare. They're not all as difficult. Floorboard, for example, is a pretty simple compound word. You might not get completely to the meaning of that word by reading it, but you're going to get pretty darn close. Words like pride are a little bit more challenging, and maybe the word hoard is challenging. Conkers and monkey nuts are idiosyncratic words to this piece and probably draw on the English vocabulary. But what you can see is that you could read this and probably get a gist or the basic idea without getting every single one of these rare words. In other words, without decoding them and without exactly knowing what they mean. The same might not be true in a nonfiction text. This is a text taken from Time for Kids, and the readability formula has disappeared off the page there, but it was at the same level on the Dale-Chall. And I took the liberty of highlighting some words. I don't know that I caught all of them, but what you can see here is that there's more repetition of words. Now, within an informational text, this repetition of the word ivory, for example, is going to actually inflate the difficulty from a readability standpoint. Not necessarily in true value, but every time the word ivory is encountered, it's treated as a unique word. But the fact is that the repetition of ivory will help to get the student to get the idea. So there's ways that the formulas can muddle things a bit. The thing that would probably make this somewhat difficult, however, is that the rare words that are used are words that are pretty critical to understanding the passage. So the idea of poacher and poaching is very important, and there is a nice context clue in that first sentence, but you'd still have to really put that together to get this. You'd also have to understand things like economy and the like. So the rare words in nonfiction texts tend to carry a little more power and need to be understood, but on the other hand, they're often repeated, and that can help. If we think about how to stretch students and we consider word accuracy levels, there have been studies that have suggested that 90% wall, especially for younger readers, may or may not be necessary. There are two studies that suggested that first and second grade students might be able to read at an 83 to 85% accuracy level and still do fine. There's some parameters around that, and I can say that might be related to the length of the text. I mean, if you're reading 150 words versus 2,000, it might be okay to read at 85%. At 6th grade, we'd expect to have slightly higher values. So these word accuracy levels that we've been treating as gospel can probably be flexed under different conditions and with kids at different developmental levels. Halliday has done some very nice some very nice thinking in a piece in the reading teacher, just reminding us that the word accuracy levels that Betts articulated were based on oral reading, and also suggesting that kids might have some tolerance for the word accuracy levels going below 90%. So I think the message is that those word accuracy levels can be questioned and tweaked some. We did a study where we looked at text levels relative to students' actual reading levels. So this data set was taken from a very large data set, and we were really trying to figure out how far can readers be stretched. And so there were instances, or there were records of students reading, and there were instances where they read a grade level above their actual level, or 2 grade levels above their actual grade level, or a half a grade level. And so you could look at, relative to their exact reading level, how they performed under different text level conditions. And that was able to shed some light, it's clearly not definitive, about what is a stretch level. We found that when kids read 76 lexiles above level, which is about a half a grade level, they could maintain a mean comprehension of about 61%. Now keep in mind this is a completely independent activity, so it's very possible that if it was a supported activity that they might be able to get closer to a reasonable comprehension level, around 70 to 75%. But nonetheless, the exploratory data suggested that we may be able to go a little over a half a grade level above without really tearing kids down. We found that when kids were reading 200 lexiles above, which is almost 2 grade levels ahead, and under independent conditions again, that they just were at 49% comprehension and really weren't doing so well. And we kind of felt like that suggested that 200 lexiles was too high. Now the question is, what is in between 76 lexiles and 200? And what kind of conditions could you manipulate so that students could do more with their comprehension? I'm sorry, I got distracted. So there's a lot more work to be done, and this was exploratory, but it still suggests 200 lexiles is too high. We also, let's see here, I'm trying to advance, there we go. We also took a look at length, and again, as I mentioned earlier, length is incredibly important because it changes so much in the elementary grades. If you think about what a first grader reads in terms of length, 50 to 250 words. I mean, kids can literally sit down and read that in 2 minutes, 3 minutes. And then you contrast that with the way that length increases in 4th grade, where a passage or a chapter or an anthology passage might be 2,000 words. So we're seeing a huge average increase in the number of words, and we're not paying attention to really what it takes to get from pictures and words to dense text. We just kind of gloss that over, and we just kind of say, oh, kids will figure it out and they'll get into chapter books. But a lot of kids don't. So what we did, oh, this is a wonderful study. Let me just regress for a minute. That essentially Freddie and Bob Calfee looked at students' performance on the California state test, and Nate found them very disparate, and realized that part of what distinguished these two texts were the number of words in them. So 350 to 400 words were in the California state test versus the Nate passages, which were 1,000 words. So again, length is clearly entering into the package. So we did a little study where we manipulated the difficulty and the length. These bars that you see represent 6 different passages. We used it within subjects design, so each kid read all of these passages. I'm sorry, my Skype keeps coming up. And essentially what we found is that kids, look at this, 1,000 word, a 400 lexile passage is a second grade passage. It's not a difficult passage. And these were third grade kids. Kids did not do as well on the longer version of even an easy passage than they did of the shorter version. And that was true of 600 lexiles. Things changed a little at 800 lexiles because there were some vocabulary issues that went into play. And I'll show you kind of what this looked like with below level readers. What this did suggest, however, was that definitely length was compounding for some kids and in some circumstances difficulty. The next focus that we gave, or that we think is really important to focus on with stretch, is the notion of stamina. And again, given the developmental trajectory in elementary school, the change of length of text, the change of demands, even the change in classroom structure. I mean, there are many 4th and 5th grades that are completely departmentalized, where we have 4th and 5th grade kids going to 4 teachers a day, versus the 1st grade class, which is self-contained. So we really felt like one of the things that is important to consider in stretch is thinking about stamina. And Hebert and Trinan and Wilson did some really interesting work in this area. Stamina is the ability to persevere with success during a difficult task. Now, it's very important, I think, to emphasize that with success, because having stamina is going to depend on persevering giving you a result. So if persevering gives you no result, it's not really helpful. And again, I'm sorry for the typo in that. I don't know how that happened. I apologize. What they found was that students who were below level had really good reading rates and comprehension in the beginning portion of a text, but after the beginning portion, they had increased rates of reading rate, but lower comprehension scores. So they were tiring towards the end of a lengthy passage. Another important consideration in thinking about how we're going to stretch kids is to consider their history. And by reading history, I mean, what was learning to read like for them? What is learning instruction like for them now? Is it a situation where they're successful, where they go into elementary school and feel like they really know what they're doing? Or is it a situation where they've had lots of years of getting the message that they're not as good as the other students? In both of the studies that I mentioned earlier, the one where we looked at text levels and length, we found that readers with different backgrounds did not respond in the same way to stretch levels. So in the study where we looked at kids' reading levels and their abilities to stretch relative to their own levels, we actually found that kids who had not done as well on their state assessment, even when the passage was relative to their own level, still were not as successful stretching. So below level readers were still slightly lower than above level, even though the absolute difficulty of the passage was the same. So it suggests that there's something going on there with their motivation and their background. And the same thing occurred with the difficult texts. When we looked at length, we had the same kind of thing going on. The blue bars are at or above level readers, and the below level readers are the red are the at or above, and the blue are the below level. And what you can see is that with that 400 lexile passage, those below level readers are much lower, even with a second grade level material. I mean, they are really dipping over 15 points in their comprehension when they see the length of a text. So that's really impacting them differently, and motivation is clearly operating there. When you think about how to stretch kids, you want to have just some basic things in place. And one of those things is knowing reading levels and knowing text levels. And that seems like one of the most obvious things to tell people, but very frankly, it's not uncommon for me to go in and work with a group of third or fourth or fifth grade teachers and to say, how do you know the kids' reading levels? And they don't have a system in place, or they have a system and they say, oh well, we'll find out at the end of October, or they'll find out the reading level and then never revisit it again until May. So you know, in your stretch toolkit has to be what's the kid's reading level and what's the text level, and without that you're not going to do anything with stretch text. But there are some nice strategies that are already out there again that can be developed. And there's a nice article in the Reading Teacher that focuses on some of these. There are a couple of strategies where the teacher reads the text mostly. And these would include shared reading or think alouds. And these are nice for modeling for kids how to do things. There are also some strategies where students listen and then they do a lot of rereading. So the fluency-oriented reading instruction, which includes listening to the teacher, echo reading, choral reading, and then partner reading the same text repeatedly, does show that kids can stretch. So rereading is kind of a task feature that we can use to stretch kids. Again, we need to establish what is the threshold for that. How much rereading is really benefiting them and how much is not. Another thing that has come up, and this was a nice little piece that came out in the Educational Researcher, is it is possible, if you want to think about stretching kids, to vary the text difficulty trajectory. So this article came out and it essentially suggests that, you know, instead of, if we want to reach career and college readiness, which is kind of marked by these dotted gray bands, these are the bands of difficulty that are represented in that table that I showed with the second, third grade level bands, etc. And it shows kind of here, this is the blue, kind of where we've been, and you can see we're coming short of what's career and college ready. But it shows various curves that might be used that are not quite as difficult on students in the earlier grades. Nonetheless, there is, you know, in other words, instead of here using this red curve and going from first grade, where you come in at over a second grade reading level, to an 800 lexile, you could vary that a bit and not expect that 800 lexile until a kid's hitting closer to mid third or fourth grade. So there is some new research out there that we're hoping will affect educational publishers and that can be put in effect, and consider where kids are coming from when they come to us, as opposed to just kind of fitting them all into a mold. I'm hoping that I'm doing okay on time here. So I wanted to just mention that there's some basic messages that I think can go back to the classroom. I will say that there's a lot of empirical work.
Actually, that does in about 3 minutes, okay?
Okay, thank you. I'll move quickly. And these are real kind of graphic, and I can move through them. So just remember that stretch is not frustration, and that we want challenge, but we don't want crashes. You know, we want to teach for challenge, but we want to watch for frustration. So we want to balance this older paradigm that focuses on frustration with a newer one that focuses on challenge. And in certain cases, we might need the two rocks in this little graphic on the challenge side. And for other kids, we might need that on the frustration side, but it's going to differ. One of the things that I'm cautious about is to beware of the read aloud solution. I can certainly see the interpretation of the Common Core standards to have kids exposed, and I use that in quotes, to challenging text through a read aloud, and that would be not at all in keeping with the intention of the Common Core state standards. I think it's important to remember that challenge is individual, and what stretches one student will not stretch another. resist the district level misinterpretation. I certainly saw this during the Reading Excellence Act years, and sometimes during Reading First. You know, this notion that every classroom is going to read on-level text because that's what the Common Core State Standard says. So you walk into a classroom and everybody in third grade has to have, you know, an 800 Lexile text. That is not what the Common Core State Standards is saying, and that is obviously going to balance on the highly frustrational level. Scaffold for stamina. This is really important. More work needs to be done. Some have likened the development of reader stamina to kind of working through pain in a physical therapy session. I like the idea of training for a marathon where you know what the goal is and it's going to be hard and you're a little afraid of it and it's daunting, but you have a training plan. And in that training plan, you're going a little further each day, and there's a support for motivation and support for comprehension. I'm a runner, and I have a set of motivating tools that I have to use. They include music and many other things that help me, so I do that. Consider readers' history and make sure that kids who have experienced less success in the past are not overstretched, and consider their emotional needs when you're working with them. And I hope that brings me to the end of 3 minutes. This is me and my 2 kids, and I'm happy to take any questions or critiques at my email. Thank you.